In the last video, I showed you how we could make use of the object center and copy those values to different models. Because again, Blender is an object-oriented application. So you have, for example, a 3D container, this object, and then you have mesh inside. So for example, I could have two objects like this and say join. And when I hit join now, it takes the mesh from my right object and copies that into the object of my left object. So you see the object is nothing else than just a container, and you can put stuff into it. Kind of like when you're in a layer program and you create a text frame, you can just write whatever text you want, but you just have one frame. And then this object has all the information about transform, etc., and also, for example, the modifier. So the modifiers are applied to the object and not really to the mesh. So that means, for example, let's say I'm duplicating this seat 2 times, and then I'm deleting those bits of information. I could, for example, again, you see, select my 2 objects, then I select my object I would like to copy information from, and instead of using copy the transform property, I would like, for example, to copy the texture. So I could go to object, make link, and basically links in this case mean that I have this modeling material once, and now I link this material to different objects. So each object is being linked to that material, and then this way, for example, is blue. So I could here say make links. So those 2 objects, I would like to get the same color like this one. And there you see it's there. You could also press Ctrl L to make links. Then you get the pop-up menu. You see this, for example, also works with modifiers. So if I click this, those 2 objects got the modifier. But not only the modifier, but also the values. So if, for example, I set this one to 0, and then press Ctrl L and say modifiers, you see it recreated the link to this object modifier and then copied also the view value. So that's, for example, in a very nice way when you have a lot of objects and you quickly want to set all the objects to 0. I could, for example, here say set this one to 0. I select everything in my scene, make sure this is my last inactive object, Control L, copy modifier, and then bang, everything is set to this value. That, for example, can be very useful when you start noticing that you have too many objects on your screen and the screen refresh is getting too slow, and you don't want to go object by object and change everything. So that's the way how you, for example, link properties and how you could move the geometry between different parts. So let me duplicate this again. And because I forgot to show you when we join this, how we get, for example, this seat out of this model. So in mesh mode, with having everything selected, I go to mesh, and then under vertices, you have, for example, separate. You could also, in edit mode, press P. And when I select separate the selection, that then, for example, moves out the geometry. So I have two new objects. The only problem is, as you can see, it copies then the original pivot point from the object you moved it out. And one last thing, with Shift D, you can duplicate objects. And when we press Alt D, we make a clone. So for example, here you say Shift D, duplicate object, and here Alt D, it says duplicate linked. So those two objects are linked to the same mesh information this object is using. So what does this mean? If we go to, for example, a triangle, that is the object data, you see that there's a small 3. And let's say I name this one seat. This one maybe I name 1. This one I name 2. This one I name 3. So we have object 1, 2, and 3. All 3 objects have a link to the same material. And all 3 objects have a link to the same polygon mesh. So you see that you have objects and you have mesh data blocks or information, and then you can link those together. So this means if I go ahead and, for example, change this, see it's all updated because they're all linked together. But if I, for example, would this one to be not linked anymore, I could simply click the 3 or go to objects and then make single user, object and data, or material. So for example, I click on the number here. That is what I very often do because I feel this is a little bit quicker. And then if I go ahead and change this, you see it doesn't affect this anymore because those two, and you see this is only a 2 now, they're shared the same geometry. This one is a single user. And if, for example, I change the color, see all objects are being changed at the same time. And that is because they're all linked. And you see I have 68 objects using this material. If I click this number, then I could change this material because I basically created a new material. So I hope this makes sense to you, but that's the way how Blender works internally. And for example, for the spokes, where this can come in very handy. For example, what I have here, you see, is one object. And let me change this. You see those other 3 spokes have the same. So they are all actually clones. So they're duplicated with a link to this geometry. So I only have to modify maybe one part, and then all the other parts are updated for me because they are just linked together.